They said he hanged himself. That was the official line, written cleanly in the coroner's report, authenticated with a municipal seal to give it the illusion of certainty. But the rope told a different truth. Its fibers twisted in a way that no natural fall could explain. It bore impressions, shallow but visible. Not fingerprints. Not from a man. The indentations were too narrow, too slight. For anyone trained in observation, they looked disturbingly like the grip of a smaller hand. A child's hand. In 1921, Connecticut's courts did not entertain such implications. Children did not kill fathers. Fathers did not bleed corruption behind manicured hedges. The state valued image over truth, and truth over the suffering of those too small to matter. The house still stands on the outskirts of Hartford County. Locals call it Hollowcrest Estate, though that was never its real name. Its windows face the old rail line where factory workers once passed, hats lowered whenever the lights were on inside. They say in winter, when the fog settles against the glass and the house breathes with the sound of old pipes expanding in the cold, you can still see movement in the East Hall. Not footsteps, not figures. Just a subtle shift, as though the wallpaper itself is holding its breath. That hallway was where the quiet man was first mentioned, not in police files, not in medical reports, but in a note scribbled in pencil, hidden between the pages of a burned ledger. He is not a man in the ordinary sense. No newspaper article ever printed his name. No priest dared include him in parish records. He was only ever referenced indirectly, always in the margins of documents written by people who should have known better. They called him the presence that stands when no one else will. Those who heard Emma speak of him did not write his title as if describing imagination. They logged it like a clinical observation, a term for a phenomenon that could not be officially acknowledged, but could no longer be denied. Children whispered about him in orphanage dormitories after lights out. Servants crossed themselves when footsteps echoed where no one walked, and fathers who behaved like kings in their own homes felt watched when they were alone. The townspeople never spoke of what happened in that estate directly. They valued reputation, decorum, the illusion of perfect families behind iron gates. To accuse a man of influence in 1921 required more bravery than most could summon. Authority protected itself. It was easier to call a tortured child imaginative, unstable, delicate. Easier to medicate her, easier to silence her. But Emma Whitlock, 8 years old, did not scream like other children. She did not cry or collapse or beg. She simply watched. And that made the adults uneasy. Control systems only work when the subject participates in their own submission. Emma did not. She observed. And worse, she reported. Not to the police. Not to her mother, who drowned herself in prescription tonics. Not to clergymen who looked away whenever Hollowcrest was mentioned. She spoke to something else. Something older than law. Something that did not need courts or signatures to assign guilt. The first recorded reference came from a nurse named Abigail Rowe, who worked briefly in the estate infirmary. She wrote only one line in her private notebook before she resigned her post and left the county forever. The child keeps staring at the far corner of the room. She says he is already here and that we are late. The estate kept its secrets hidden behind chandeliers and piano music. Servants were trained to never speak above a whisper. Children visiting from neighboring families were not allowed beyond the garden. The walls, polished and dusted daily, held screams like a vault holds coins, perfectly secured behind fine wood and silence. The father, a man of factory wealth and precise etiquette, hosted charitable dinners in the west parlor, while his daughter stared blankly from the upper landing, her hands folded like a witness awaiting trial. Guests would compliment her posture, her quiet grace. They never asked why she watched the room the way one watches a stage before violence begins. Every photograph taken of her from that year shows the same detail. While others face the camera, Emma's gaze drifts left, just off frame, as if acknowledging a figure only she can see. In one image, the last known before the incident, her lips are not smiling but set in the faintest curve of certainty, like someone who knows something irreversible is about to happen. People like to believe evil announces itself with thunder. It doesn't. In Hollowcrest Estate, it entered quietly, sat at the table, and was handed a drink like any other guest. In a world where fathers were kings, no one imagined that the smallest voice in the house would become its historian. Emma spoke only when necessary, And when asked who stood with her in the night, she answered without blinking, "The quiet man. He waits because you won't." That was the first warning. The quiet man was not drawn like Mr. Shadow. Children often sketch their fears with clumsy lines, monsters with teeth, exaggerated eyes, wild, chaotic shapes. Emma's depiction was nothing like that. In the only surviving piece of her artwork, recovered years later from the basement of St. Agnes Orphanage, he is shown standing perfectly still. No claws, no distorted face, just a tall, slender silhouette, featureless, with his head slight, eye tilted as if listening. There is no implied motion, no raised arms. He does not threaten, he witnesses. And that, for reasons adults never understood, is what made him terrifying. Witnesses are dangerous. They strip away narrative control. In 1921, a wealthy man's greatest weapon was not money, it was silence enforced through image. Appear respectable, and the town protects you. Be seen hosting social dinners, shaking hands with church elders, sending donations in polished envelopes with gold seals, and your sins become unthinkable by design. Men like Charles Whitlock did not just shape industry, they sculpted visibility. They understood that in a civilized society, the most efficient cage is the one built with etiquette. You don't need to hide evil when you can simply dress it in tailored suits and polished shoes. Emma saw through it, not with rebellion or tantrums, but with unbearable calm. She did not accuse, she did not weep or plead or make frantic scenes. Instead, she behaved as though the trial had already happened and the verdict had been delivered in a courtroom unseen by men. Those around her reported a stillness that unsettled the air. Her governess resigned after only 8 days, writing in her exit record that the child does not fear him as much as she judges him. That was a sin far worse than fear. A fearful child is manageable. Fear can be silenced, redirected, dismissed as hysteria. But a child who judges, a child who observes like a recorder of events, that is a liability. Abusers fear evidence more than resistance. And in the Whitlock estate, evidence had taken the shape of an 8-year-old girl with dark eyes and a voice that did not tremble. Those who served in the estate reported strange phenomena, though none of them used supernatural terms. They were practical people, maids, groundsmen, a cook who had worked for the Whitlocks for 19 years before packing her belongings into a single cloth sack one winter night and walking 30 miles by foot to New Haven without explanation. She later said only this before refusing further interviews. There were nights when the child sat at the end of the hallway, hands in her lap, whispering to someone I could not see. But she wasn't begging, she wasn't praying, she was updating. That word stayed in the original notes. Updating. Not pleading, not imagining. Updating. As though she was reporting the day's injustices to something that kept score. Hartford's upper class dismissed these accounts as superstition from servants with vivid imaginations. But servants do not fantasize about horror. Their lives are too rooted in survival for theatrics. When they speak of shadows that stand too long in one place, of footsteps that stop outside a child's door then retreat slowly, not due to hesitation but due to warning, they do not dramatize. They testify. Emma never screamed, not when doors locked from the inside, not when the night footsteps approached and retreated, not even when she told Dr. Morrison in a tone as light as a weather report, "He only hurts me when they're all asleep." Morrison recorded the line in ink so dark it pressed through the page. In her private notes, separate from the official file she submitted, she wrote, "The subject speaks without emotion. The phrase, 'he only hurts me when they're all asleep,' indicates dissociation, not from fear, but from expectation. Abuse is not an interruption in her life. It is the stable pattern around which she has built her internal structure. There is no collapse. There is only record." To professionals in trauma psychology, what few existed at the time, that detail was chilling. Some children detach from pain as a defense, but Emma wasn't detaching. She was observing, documenting, preparing something like a ledger. In Section 7 of Morrison's restricted journal, a passage remains heavily smudged, as if someone tried to erase it after writing. Child requested I leave a space at the bottom of the page. When I asked why, she said, "He'll fill it in later. He knows how. I inquired who she meant. She looked to the far corner of the room, lifted her chin slightly, and said with absolute certainty, "The quiet man writes last." After that note, Morrison stopped attempting to correct Emma's language. She realized she was not dealing with typical projection. Children invent imaginary friends for comfort. Emma's figure served an entirely different purpose. Judgment, not revenge. Judgment. There is a difference. Revenge seeks emotional satisfaction. Judgment seeks balance. Emma never asked for rescue. That was the detail that disturbed Morrison the most. Children in anguish beg for escape, cry for saviors, even invent heroes. Emma invented a witness, a thing that did not intervene, it only watched. And that was enough to ensure consequences would happen. Not now, but eventually. The child had accepted that no one in the house would save her. So she had aligned herself with something patient, something that never sleeps. There is a particular kind of silence that exists in wealthy homes, the kind that is polished, rehearsed, and weaponized. In Hollowcrest Estate, silence was not the absence of sound, it was policy. Servants learned quickly that even the smallest disturbances, dropped cutlery, a cough during supper, footsteps too swift across the upstairs corridor, were met with a pause in the air so thick it felt like suffocation. Charles Whitlock did not need to raise his voice to control the household. Control, when perfected, becomes atmospheric. Emma understood this before she ever spoke of the quiet man. Abuse did not begin with violence. Violence is crude, loud, inefficient. True control begins with compliance training, the slow conditioning of a child to speak softly, move gently, smile when guests arrive, and never contradict the man who funds the church renovations and cuts ribbons at school ceremonies. By the time real harm begins, the world outside has already agreed that it cannot possibly be true. That is why Emma did not scream. Screamers are dismissed. Quiet children are listened to, but only by the thing that listens for truth, not theatrics. In an interview documented 6 years after the incident, a former servant named Ruth Harrington described an evening that never made it into official accounts. She was dusting the grand staircase when she heard a soft murmuring from the upstairs landing. Expecting 2 of the younger maids, she ascended quietly, preparing to reprimand them for idle chatter. What she found instead stopped her in place. Emma, sitting perfectly upright at the top of the stairs, hands clasped in her lap, speaking in a low voice to no one visible. Not prayer, not play. Report. Ruth recounted. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't asking someone to protect her. She was informing, like a soldier giving a status update to a superior officer. When asked what she heard, Ruth hesitated, then said 3 words that police found nonsensical. Names and dates. Not stories, not fantasies, names and dates. This was no imaginary friend in the way adults understood the concept. This was record-keeping, evidence-building, and that terrified the staff far more than any talk of ghosts or shadows. Because a ghost punishes. But a witness exposes. 2 days later, Ruth left Hollowcrest without collecting her final wages. She told no one why. But in her written departure notice submitted to the estate manager, one sentence appeared in shaky script. She keeps looking to the corner before she speaks, as if awaiting permission. Awaiting permission. That phrase reappeared in multiple independent accounts. Emma, the child at the center of the house's darkest secret, never spoke of her pain without first shifting her gaze. Slightly left, slightly down, as if confirming that her words were being properly recorded. In her private case journal, Dr. Morrison noted the abnormality of Emma's composure under questioning. She wrote, "Patient describes harm with a tone of clerical accuracy, no tears, no evident distress, instead a curious form of assurance. She speaks like someone who has already survived the event she is describing." This observation contradicted the accepted psychological models of the time. Trauma victims, especially children, were expected to exhibit fear, disorientation, emotional volatility. Emma presented none. She did not avoid the subject. She did not flinch. She delivered her statements like a surgeon making incisions, clean, precise, clinical, and always with an implied witness. That unsettled Morrison more than any mention of bruises or locked doors. She realized the child did not believe she was alone in what she had endured. Far more chilling, she behaved as though it had already been addressed by a higher authority. In the second week of sessions, Morrison attempted a direct approach. She asked Emma plainly, "Do you want your father punished?" The room held still. Margaret, the mother, froze mid-motion, teacup halfway to her lips. Charles, seated by the window, closed a ledger and rested his hand on the arm of his chair. The air itself seemed to tighten. Emma did not look at them. She did not look at Morrison. She looked to the corner of the room, eyes steady, as though checking if the question was valid enough to answer. A moment passed. Then she spoke in a tone so calm it made the hair on Morrison's arms rise. "That's not for me to decide. He already knows." Morrison, maintaining professionalism, asked, "Who knows?" Emma's answer was not emotional. It carried no malice, no fear, only description. "The one who stands when no one else will." She did not say his name. She didn't need to. That was the first time Morrison wrote the quiet man in her notes, her hand trembling, each letter pressed deep into the paper. It was also the moment she realized something horrifying. Emma was not waiting to be saved. She believed the saving had already been scheduled. There is a type of quiet that precedes a storm in human history, the quiet of witnesses stepping back, not out of fear, but out of ceremony. That was the quiet that settled over Hollowcrest Estate in the days before the rope was found. Wealthy families often believe their homes are fortresses, impenetrable, insulated from consequence. But fortresses have blind spots, and in Hollowcrest Estate, that blind spot was the hallway outside Emma's room. Servants avoided it after dusk. Not because they feared the girl. They feared the way the air changed near her door. Maids reported the sensation of being observed, not by the child, but by something behind them, as though a presence lingered just out of reach, patient and unmoving, none of woe. These accounts were preserved in official testimony. Servants were not called to speak, and even if they had been, they would not have spoken honestly. In 1921, the word of a servant weighed less than the polished silence of a man like Charles Whitlock. His reputation made him untouchable. His donations to the parish guaranteed the church's loyalty. His alliances in politics made legal scrutiny inconvenient. Men like him didn't get accused. They got praised. That was the law, not written in ink, but etched into the spine of the town. Yet for all his control, something had begun to shift in the house, subtle at first. Guests stopped staying as long during Sunday dinners. Conversations grew shorter. Margaret, once the elegant hostess of Hartford's finest gatherings, began to lose weight rapidly. Her eyes, dull with chemical sedation, often drifted toward the staircase where Emma would sit silently, hands in her lap. She stopped touching her daughter's hair, stopped speaking to her entirely, except to say one repeated phrase when passing her in the hall. "You shouldn't look at people like that." It was not scolding, it was fear disguised as etiquette. Charles noticed it too, though he never said so. A man like him did not confess unease. But servants reported that he no longer walked past Emma without clearing his throat first, as if announcing himself to a child. The cook recounted hearing him pause outside Emma's room late one night. She heard the click of the doorknob, his hand lingering on the metal, but he did not enter. Instead, she heard him whisper under his breath, too low to catch anything but tone. It was not affection, it was warning. Something had disrupted the natural order. Abusers operate under the expectation of unchecked dominance. But dominance falters when the victim stops behaving like prey, and Emma, small, 8, socially isolated Emma, had done the unthinkable. She had ceased to fear, not because she believed she would be rescued, but because she believed judgment had already entered the house. The first documented fracture in Charles's composure occurred on a cold evening in November. A visiting business associate reported that during supper, he noticed Emma seated upright as always at the far end of the table. She did not eat. She did not speak. She simply observed, gaze steady, not at her father but past him, toward the empty space behind his chair. The guest later described it like this. "It was as though she was waiting for someone else to arrive, and in that moment, even without turning, I felt as if someone was standing just behind Mr. Whitlock watching him. It made no sense. There was no one there. Yet I felt, truly felt, that if I reached out my hand, I would touch a shoulder. He did not mention this in his written statement to the authorities. He only shared it privately in a letter that was never sent, found years later among unsent correspondence after his death. That letter ended with a line that stands out among the clutter of polite refusals and social apologies. I have never before felt pity for a man condemned by nothing more than a child's gaze. That was the difference between a ghost story and what unfolded in Hollowcrest. Ghosts haunt to terrify. The quiet man did not haunt. He just stood. He bore witness, and in the presence of a true witness, monsters lose certainty. Men like Charles rely on doubt. Doubt shields them. Doubt keeps courts hesitant and communities loyal. But a child sitting silently at the end of a long, polished table, looking not at her abuser but at something behind him, introduces a kind of dread that does not scream. It waits. Waiting is more terrifying than rage. Several unearthed diary pages from Margaret tried to rationalize the feeling. She stares as if he is not the one in control. She looks through him, past him, as though recording. She does not weep. She does not beg. She has expectation. Rumors began circulating in Hartford's quiet corners. Whispers among housewives, murmurs in confessional booths, things said in low tones outside church steps. They did not speak directly of sin. They spoke of atmosphere, of a house that seemed to lean inward, as if the walls themselves were listening. Those who passed the estate late at night claimed the upstairs windows were sometimes lit, not with the warm flicker of lamplight, but with something else, a still, unmoving glow, pale as breath on glass. They said that if you stood too long outside the gates, you felt as though someone inside had already noticed you. Someone, not something. There is a critical difference. Hauntings are messy, witnessing is orderly, and something in Hollowcrest had begun keeping score. Some say the true moment a crime begins is not when harm is done, but when someone chooses to look away. By that measure, the Whitlock estate had been a crime scene long before any body was found. The town looked away, the church looked away, even the servants trapped between employment and conscience looked away. Only one pair of eyes refused to avert. That is why the quiet man appeared for her, and not for them. The event that marked the turning point, the moment when the estate shifted from quiet dread to something far darker, occurred on a night without storm, without lightning, without drama. True horror selects ordinary nights because spectacle draws attention, and attention invites intervention. Emma sat at her small writing desk, a single candle burning. According to later recovered notes, she had begun listing names, not in childish scrawl but with meticulous, almost clerical precision. The list contained no accusations, only names, then dates. It was the order that disturbed Dr. Morrison when she eventually saw it. Names of those who had looked away, not just her father, not just the ones who harmed her, the cook who stayed silent, the governess who heard but walked past, the doctor who noticed bruises and blamed growth symptoms, even the pastor who placed a gentle hand on her head during Sunday Mass, saying nothing while looking directly into the eyes of a child who had stopped blinking. When Morrison asked Emma what the list was for, the girl did not hesitate. She spoke the phrase that sealed the case in a vault of unease forever. He asked me to write it. He says names matter. He, not Mr. Shadow, not a childhood nickname. He, as if everyone should already know who she meant. On that same night, a servant named Leo Farrow was returning from the cellar when he heard movement upstairs. Expecting Emma, he ascended quietly, planning to escort her back to her room. But halfway up, he froze, because she wasn't alone. Emma stood at the end of the hallway, candlelight flickering behind her. She was looking not at Leo, but past him, behind him. Slowly, with trembling hands, he turned. There was no one there. But his body reacted as though something stood inches away, too close, too still. He reported later, in writing, before vanishing from the county entirely. It felt light. Kierman was standing there, not cold like a spirit, but present. Like someone living, breathing, watching me, watching him. Watching me, watching him. That phrase stayed with investigators. It was peculiar, precise. Like Emma, Leo didn't describe a haunting. He described an exchange of observation, like being added to a ledger. By morning, Leo had resigned. He did not collect his belongings. He did not speak to anyone. He simply walked away and never returned. Something had shifted. That is when people in town began avoiding the road near Hollow Crest. They crossed the street when passing by the iron gates, heads lowered, as if acknowledging a funeral procession no one had announced. Not out of superstition, out of guilt. Somewhere deep down, every adult who had ever smiled politely at Charles Whitlock yet felt something wrong beneath his polished civility now felt a new weight upon them. The weight of being watched back. And that is why you are here, not to be entertained, not to consume horror like a story. You are here because stories like these are not history, they are mirrors. They ask a question that modern men rarely want to confront. When evil stands in a house and no one speaks, do you believe the house forgets? Look at your screen. Feel the unsettled awareness in your chest. That sensation you feel right now, that is the gaze. The quiet man is not summoned by violence, he is summoned by neglect, by the moment good men do nothing and call it restraint. If you understand what that means, comment this phrase twice to mark yourself as someone who sees. I see the quiet man, I see the quiet man. Not for engagement, not for algorithm, for record, because once you write it, you can never again claim you didn't know. The first person to hear him breathe was not Emma, it was her mother. Margaret Whitlock was awake long past midnight, sitting at the dressing table, the orange flame of a kerosene lamp trembling as she brushed her hair. The rest of the house slept, or pretended to. Through the mirror she saw her own reflection flicker as though the lamp had dimmed. She thought at first the wick was dying. Then she realized the light hadn't changed. The air had. She stopped brushing, listened. At first, nothing. Then a faint exhale, slow and deliberate behind her left shoulder. Not wind, not pipes. Breathing, steady, measured, patient. She turned her head just enough to see the corner where her husband's overcoat hung on a stand. The coat's fabric swayed gently, though there was no draft. In that same moment, the mirror caught something her eyes missed directly. A tall silhouette, featureless, tilting its head toward her as if studying her reflection. She did not scream. She dropped the brush. It rolled once, twice, then stopped. The mirror showed her face again, alone now. The corner was empty, the coat was still, but the air still remembered him. Margaret told no one, not out of confusion, but because of the realization that arrived with the silence. He had not come for her. She was peripheral, an observer, like everyone else. The quiet man had come for judgment, and she, too, had been a witness who did nothing. From that night, she stopped sleeping in her husband's room. In the following days, the staff began noticing strange behaviors. Charles no longer took his evening brandy. He refused to use mirrors in his study. Servants were ordered to remove them all, yet in their absence he seemed more restless, more aware that, reflection or not, something still watched. His hands began to tremble when signing documents. He walked faster through hallways, turning abruptly as if catching a glimpse of something trailing just behind his shoulder. He began leaving lamps on in every room. Firelight, he said, kept the chill away. But the servants noticed that every lamp he lit faced a wall, never the open space behind him. On the third day after Margaret's encounter, Charles dismissed half the staff. Cost-cutting measures, he told Morrison when she arrived for her session. But the doctor suspected otherwise. Hollow Crest was growing quieter, emptier, easier for secrets to echo in. The few servants who remained avoided eye contact. Emma's sessions became shorter, and her drawings darker, not chaotic, but composed. One sketch in particular drew Morrison's attention. Emma had drawn the grand dining hall, every detail immaculate from the chandelier to the long table, but behind the head chair where her father sat, she had added a second figure, tall, black, no face. Its hand rested on the back of her father's chair. Morrison asked what the figure was doing. Emma replied softly, waiting for him to finish pretending. Morrison's hand shook as she wrote. The detail matched Margaret's mirror description exactly, same tilt of the head, same proximity. The convergence of independent accounts made denial impossible. Either this was a case of mass suggestion or something beyond suggestion had taken root inside Hollowcrest. That night, Morrison stayed later than usual, reviewing her notes by the parlor fire. At 11:07 p.m., she heard the floorboards creak in the hallway. Assuming a servant, she ignored it. Then she heard a second set of steps, slower, deliberate, heavy. She turned, calling out. No answer, yet her pulse quickened, her breath shortening. In her own words, written that night, "It is the sound of someone walking without intention of arrival. They move as though merely to remind you that they can." She left the estate before dawn, refusing further sessions until the father agreed to formal evaluation. He never did. Within a week, Hollowcrest began to unravel. Charles started speaking to himself. Servants overheard him muttering warnings into the air, commands for something unseen to stop standing there, to say what you came to say. One night, he tore the sheets from his bed and threw them into the fireplace, shouting that someone had been lying next to him. By the time the flames died, he was laughing, and through it all, Emma remained composed. She told her governess, "He's showing Daddy how it feels." When asked what she meant, she simply answered, "To be watched while you hurt someone." That was the final entry in Dr. Morrison's journal before the discovery that ended the case. The morning of December 14th, 1921, the butler found Charles Whitlock hanging from a ceiling beam in his study. The coroner wrote suicide, but the body's position contradicted every known dynamic of a hanging. The rope was looped improperly, twice in opposite directions, the stool was still upright, and the rope fibers bore impressions inconsistent with adult grip. Small hands. Emma was found in her room, calm, sitting cross-legged on the floor, writing in her notebook. When asked what she was doing, she replied, "Finishing the list." When questioned later, she said nothing about her father's death. Only one phrase remained recorded in the official transcript. He said the last name was his. And when the nurse asked who said that, Emma looked to the corner of the room, smiled faintly, and whispered, "The quiet man writes last." The investigation began like any other high-profile case involving a man of status, quietly, with every effort made to protect reputation over truth. The Hartford authorities did not storm Hollowcrest with urgency. They arrived with polished boots and softened language, speaking in restrained tones as though performing grief rather than seeking justice. The coroner, a friend of Charles, photographed with him at several charity auctions, signed the death as suicide without a second inspection. Impossible. The word surfaced in private more than once. A man cannot hang himself from that angle with the rope twisted in opposing tension and leave the stool untouched beneath him. It suggested either assistance or, something far worse, intervention by unseen force. But the world does not write such terms in official documents. Instead, they wrote positional anomaly, a phrase used when truth becomes too heavy for ink. Dr. Helena Morrison was not invited to the inquest. She attended anyway, standing in the marble hallway outside the chamber where decisions were made behind closed doors. She watched the men in tailored coats speak in hushed tones, not about what happened, but about how it should be remembered. That is the function of institutions, not to record truth, but to shape memory. She recognized it instantly. A father had died, a child had spoken, and now the system would begin its oldest ritual, the burial of narrative. They interviewed Emma only once, a perfunctory questioning. Two men in pressed uniforms. They asked her if she saw her father that night. She nodded. They asked her if he was alone. She said, "No." They exchanged uneasy glances. One leaned forward, adopting the gentle tone used by adults trying to coax a child back into compliance. "Who was with him, Emma?" She blinked once, turned her head slightly, not toward the men but toward the corner of the room. "The one you don't write about." Silence, the kind that stings. The transcript ends there. No follow-up question is recorded. The official notes claim Emma ceased responding and was excused. But Morrison, who stood unseen at the doorway, saw something else. Both officers refused to turn their heads toward the corner. They stared straight ahead like men who knew that if they acknowledged what Emma referenced, even with a glance, they would become part of the record. Because that is how the quiet man works. He does not punish, he observes, and observation itself becomes sentence. Those who heard Emma speak began to feel it. An itch beneath the ribs, a presence behind their shoulders whenever they tried to dismiss her words. The two officers both requested reassignment within a month. One turned in his badge entirely and moved to Ohio. Neither provided a reason. The local newspaper wrote a small obituary for Charles Whitlock 3 days later. It described him as a pillar of industry, a devoted father, a symbol of American success. Emma's name was not mentioned. Margaret's grief was described as delicate suffering worthy of respect. No mention of rope, no mention of anomalies, no mention of a ledger. But behind the scenes, Morrison retrieved Emma's final notebook page, the one written the morning after the body was found. It listed all the names: father, mother, servants, priest, doctor, governess, and at the bottom the last name appeared in handwriting not matching Emma's usual precision. The letter looked dragged, imperfect, like strokes carved rather than written. C. Whitlock. Witnessed. Not guilty. Not punished. Witnessed. Morrison stared at that word for hours. Witnessed. In legal terms it meant nothing. In moral terms it meant everything. It meant he was seen. The quiet man had never been a vengeful apparition. He was a scribe, a presence born not of anger, but of record-keeping. You must understand this if you are to understand the danger. When a crime is committed in silence, punishment is optional. When a crime is witnessed, punishment becomes inevitable, whether by rope, reputation, or the unraveling of the mind. The Whitlock case never went to trial. The estate was sold. Margaret disappeared into sanatorium care under a false name. Emma was placed in the guardianship of a distant relative. She did not resist. She walked calmly through the gates one final time, never once looking back. But as she passed the threshold, witnesses reported seeing her pause, not to cry, not to cling to a memory, but to speak one final line into the empty air. You wrote it. So now they can't say they didn't know. One servant claimed she heard something in reply. A breath, just a breath. And then the faintest whisper of fabric, like a coat shifting in a corner where no one stood. What you are hearing now is not just a story. It is a continuation of the ledger. The quiet man does not vanish when a house empties. He moves on to wherever silence still protects monsters. And now you know. The Whitlock case did not end with a body and a sealed report. Cases like this never end. They linger, not in headlines, but in the nervous habits of survivors, in the way people glance over their shoulder before speaking, in the way silence begins to feel like complicity rather than safety. Every person connected to Hollowcrest carried something with them when they left, and someone carried them back. The first documented aftermath came from Margaret's attending physician at St. Helena's Sanitarium. He wrote in his confidential observations, "Patient experiences auditory presence, reports feeling she is being politely accompanied at all times. No signs of mania, no erratic behavior, only the persistent belief that she is never alone in a room, even when staff confirm she is." Politely accompanied, that phrasing unnerved even the hardened doctors of St. Helena's. It did not fit the profile of hallucination. Hallucinations disturb, demonic delusions terrorize, but politely accompanied. It suggested something else entirely. She was being witnessed. Margaret did not scream in her sleep, nor did she exhibit violent breaks. Instead, she would sit upright in the dark, smoothing the sheets beside her as if making space for someone to sit. When nurses asked who she was waiting for, she always gave the same answer: "He doesn't sit, he stands." She died 19 months later. No official cause was listed beyond respiratory failure, but the nurse who discovered her wrote a single unsanctioned note in her personal journal. Her eyes were open, focused on the sea, corner, calm. She did not die afraid. She died watched. The others did not fare even that well. The priest who blessed the Whitlock estate shortly after the death resigned from his parish without explanation. His final sermon, delivered to a nearly empty church, deviated from his planned scripture. Instead, he said something no one expected from a man of faith. Some sins do not cry out for God's judgment. They simply wait to be seen, and once seen, they become unavoidable. He walked out of the church, leaving his Bible on the altar. It was found open, but not to any page of scripture. Instead, written in the margins in ink darker than the rest, were 5 words: "There is always a witness." He was later found living alone in a rented room above a dying tailor's shop. When approached by a local reporter asking about the Whitlock case, he closed his door without a word. Witnesses claimed his hands were shaking, not with anger, with acknowledgement, as though he feared speaking because speaking makes you part of the story. The coroner drank himself out of public life within years. In a rare moment of honesty, one barmaid swore she heard him mutter into his glass, "That house, that case, that girl. We signed the report. We all signed it. That means our names are in there too." When asked what "there" was, he reportedly whispered, "Wherever he keeps them." Then he wept. But the most disturbing report came from a lesser-known figure, Harold Price, the clerk responsible for filing the death certificate. Clerks do not make history, they preserve it. Harold filed everything under municipal order, stamping the official record with perfect calligraphy. But he made a quiet error that went unnoticed by his superiors. In the line marked "Cause of Death," he wrote "Witnessed," then struck it out and wrote "Suicide." But ink remembers first intentions. Years later, when that certificate was recovered from a municipal archive, you could still see the faint ghost-like trace beneath "Suicide," "Witnessed," like something trying to surface beneath paper that refused to acknowledge it. When investigators attempted to recontact Harold Price for clarification, he had already vanished. His rented room was abandoned. The landlord said he had left in the middle of the night, but the bed was made perfectly, and on the pillow lay a sheet of paper with no handwriting, only an indentation, as though someone had pressed a finger down firmly into the page. One finger, one press, no ink, only record. You must understand something crucial now. The quiet man does not punish randomly. He does not roam like a spirit in folklore. He attends. He attends every instance where silence buries suffering. And once he attends, he enters the ledger. Not a physical book, not a document you can burn. The ledger is made of memory, but not your memory, his. What began in Hollow Crest did not stay there, because everywhere in America, families like the Whitlocks stood behind iron gates and called it virtue. Every estate with secrets, every church that refused to listen, every mother who looked away, every official who let ink absolve violence. These are not stories, these are recurrences. And now you have heard one. That means you are no longer outside it. You have looked. And once you look, your name is either on the side of silence or on the side of witness. There is no third option. Hollow Crest Estate was not an anomaly. Men like Charles Whitlock did not exist in isolation. They thrived within a system designed to protect the image of fatherhood over the safety of children. In the 1920s, America worshipped patriarchs. A man's home was his domain. His word was law. His sins were private matters. His daughter's silence was considered discipline, not evidence. But what happens when silence no longer protects? Something steps in to record. In every town, there are houses people avoid. Not haunted houses, respected houses. The ones with trimmed hedges, polished windows, smiling children in Sunday clothes. The ones that get invited to charity galas. The ones people point to and say, "Now that's a proper family." Hollow Crest was one of those. That is why no one believed Emma. Not because they didn't see, but because they saw too much wealth, too much status, too much comfort, and chose to categorize her distress as imagination, not testimony. But imagination does not leave finger drags in rope fiber. Imagination does not make grown men resign their posts and walk into exile with no explanation. Imagination does not cause a coroner to write "witnessed" before striking it out. Something else does. In sealed psychiatric records, Dr. Morrison wrote an addendum never meant for court review. It was addressed not to officials, but to whoever would read the truth after the era of silence ended. It read, "We classify the phenomenon as psychological projection because our language has no place for a witness that does not intervene, only records. The child did not conjure a protector, she conjured an auditor. An auditor, not guardian, not phantom. Auditor, a force that tallies what the world pretends not to see." The quiet man was not summoned by fear, he was summoned by betrayal, the betrayal of a child whose suffering was met not with outrage, but with polite dismissal. And here is the part that chills more than any ghost story could. The quiet man does not leave when the abuser dies, he stays for the ones who watched. That is why Hollowcrest felt haunted even after Charles's death. Servants reported hearing footsteps long after the estate emptied. Real estate agents attempting to sell the property complained of a presence in the upstairs corridor that made their speech falter. Not terror, guilt. One agent described it in a private letter to his wife, sealed and never delivered. I walked the third-floor hallway where the girl once slept. Halfway down, I felt the urge to speak out loud, say I'm sorry. I don't know why. I wasn't even there when it happened. But I felt noticed, as if I had arrived too late to apologize. Too late. That phrase recurs often in the surviving correspondences tied to the estate. Too late to help, too late to intervene, too late to say, I saw it but said nothing. And that is where you, too, listener, step into the narrative. You might think you are safe, that Hollowcrest is just a story, that the quiet man is just a metaphor for guilt, for complicity, for generational silence, that this is about other families, from another era, in a house you will never enter. But that is the first lie people tell themselves before they join the ledger. He is not tied to location, he is tied to behavior. He appears wherever a child speaks and is not believed, wherever a house goes quiet when harm happens, wherever institutions say, there is no evidence, even when the evidence is breathing in front of them. He does not punish swiftly. Swift punishment is mercy. He waits. He gives people time to choose whether they will acknowledge or ignore. That is what makes him different from a haunting. He does not chase, he simply remains. And in time, they come to him. That is the horror adults fear most. Consequence without confrontation. Men who beat, women who stay silent, neighbors who mind their own business, priests who tell victims to pray and forgive, doctors who label harm as imagination, investigators who close files because the perpetrator is a respected member of the community. They all share one fate. Eventually they feel watched, and they don't know why. They won't see anything in the mirrors. They won't hear whispers. No door will slam. No plate will fall. That would be too theatrical, too comforting. Instead, they will sense a presence in the corner when they are alone, not angry, not vengeful, just present. And they will understand too late. Their name was added to the list the moment they looked away. This is not a warning, this is a courtesy. Now that you have heard this, you do not get to pretend ignorance. This story is no longer about Hollowcrest. It is about every door behind which a child sits, silent, waiting to see if anyone will stand beside them, or if someone else will have to. And if that someone else arrives, you will pray he came for judgment, not for record. Because record comes first. Punishment comes after. The rope was only the beginning. There is a moment, always quiet, when a house becomes more than a place, when air becomes archive, when silence becomes testimony. Hollowcrest reached that moment not when Charles Whitlock died, but when people outside its walls learned what happened and chose what to do with that knowledge. That is when the ledger grew. You may believe you are only listening to a story, but you felt it, didn't you? That subtle shift around Section 5, that tightening in your chest as names were written, that instinct to look over your shoulder when Emma said, "The quiet man writes last." You told yourself, natural reaction. Just a story, just atmosphere. No, it was recognition, not of ghosts, of order. Every era has its watchers. In ancient courts they were scribes. In religious texts they were angels marking deeds. In industrial America it is something else, a presence that lingers not to frighten, but to ensure the truth is seen. Horror doesn't come from claws and fangs. It comes from inevitable acknowledgement, from the moment denial becomes impossible. In that sense, the quiet man is not horror. He is clarity. And clarity is what destroys men who built their lives on reputation and shadows. Ask yourself, Why did Emma not scream when the rope was found? Why did she not weep? Because she knew something most people spend their lives avoiding, that when truth is finally witnessed, the guilty begin to destroy themselves. They unravel, they choke on their own lies, they create their own nooses. He does not need to tighten the rope. He only needs to stand there. That is the nature of watching. Presence alone becomes sentence. In the final sealed notes recovered from Dr. Morrison's case journal, written in a separate folder marked "Do Not Catalogue," she admitted something that she never spoke to any colleague, any court, any church tribunal, not even in confidential testimony. I went back to Hollowcrest after it emptied. I walked the hallway outside Emma's room. I felt it. Not fear, but instruction. As though someone stood just behind me, not asking, not threatening, simply waiting for me to write what I saw. I wrote it. And only then did the air release me. Look at those words. Not waiting for her to believe. Waiting for her to document. That is the distinction. Belief is irrelevant. Record is what matters. And now a question must be asked, not of priests or doctors or courts, but of you. You have heard the record, you have followed the dissent, you have invoked the words in Section 5 and marked yourself as one who sees. Do you understand what that means? It means that in the system this presence operates within, you are no longer a passive viewer, you are a witness. Which means that from this moment on, silence and speech are no longer equal choices. To ignore suffering after hearing this is no longer ignorance, it's participation. You think you will forget this video, that you will scroll, move on, let the next piece of content swallow up the discomfort. But something has already been written, not on your skin, not on your devices, in your memory. Memory is binding. That is why the quiet man does not chase. He doesn't need to. Once you've seen, he knows where to find you, when the next house goes silent. Not to hurt you, to see what you do. Do you look away? Do you speak? Do you write? Do you pretend it's not your place? He won't stop you. But he will stand in the corner, like he did in Hollowcrest, like he did behind Charles Whitlock's chair, waiting not for your belief, but for your choice. Some people hear stories like this and feel relief when they end. Some people hear them and feel something else, a calling, a sharp awareness that something ancient and quiet is still walking beside us, in schools, in churches, in living rooms behind locked doors, not interfering, just recording, waiting to see if anyone will stand before. He has to. Those who understand this will not sleep comfortably tonight. They are not meant to. You have heard the ledger. Now you must choose which side you are on. But remember this, he writes last, and when he does not use ink. He uses names,